Hello everyone, welcome back to the Adkup Show. Today we'll talk about one interesting yet concerning topic. Is America bankrupt or speeding toward bankruptcy and ultimate collapse? We will use the latest data and some argument to understand why America is unofficially a bankrupt country. It's wild and scary. So without wasting time, let's get started. First off, let's start by analyzing this graph or picture or whatever you will call it. Look at it carefully. It shows that it took 221 years for the US to accumulate debt of $12 trillion. And between 2020 to 2024, that's only 4 years. The US added 12 trillion more to its debt. That's a disaster. The US debt is so big that if you stacked up $36 trillion in $100 bills, you would encircle Earth like 150 times. Back in 2019, it was $23 trillion, meaning the US has piled up 57% more in just 6 years. Let's further try to analyze this. So between 1800 and 1940, the debt remains relatively low and stable with some minor fluctuations until around 1940. This reflects a period of low debt accumulation interrupted by events like war, example the Civil War and the World War I. But overall, the debt stays very low. Now, between 1940 to 1980, there is a noticeable but gradual increase in debt, particularly after World War II, as the US financed wartime and post-war recovery efforts. By 1980, the debt approaches $1 trillion, but it is still relatively modest compared to the later years. The society and the US government wasn't feeling the debt burden. Then from late 20th century to early 21st century, that is 1980 to 2000, the debt begins to rise more steeply, reaching around $5 to $6 trillion by 2000. This acceleration can be attributed to factors like increased government spending, tax policies, and economic challenges. Example, the Reagan-era deficits, the 1990s economic expansion, and early response to globalization. This was also the period where international trade was getting intensified. Big corporations were going international and military spending to guard the trading routes increased as this economic model was enforced by the US on the world. This period is also referred as a period of liberalization, and it was after Bretton Woods era. This was a time when the world was getting interconnected like never before. It was obvious for the US government to spend more money to expand and to sustain the structure. However, even during this period, the debt burden wasn't felt hard on the US taxpayers and the government. Now then comes the period of 2000 to 2020, where things started going out of control, but still nobody was realizing it. Everybody was dealing this disaster. The most dramatic increase in debt occurs after 2000. After 2000, the debt skyrocketed. By 2020, the debt exceeds $30 trillion, showing an almost vertical climb. And now we are in the era where the US government is saying we have too much of debt on us. Donald Trump, after coming to White House, immediately addressed this issue. Elon Musk, who is a very big supporter of Donald Trump, formed a group by the name DOGE, that is Department of Government Efficiency. The job of this agency is to save money by cutting down spending and reducing red tapeism. DOGE and Trump administration has fired thousands of federal employees as of now. Not just that, but the US also cut off all the foreign assistance by shutting down US aid, which was pretty much a CIA fund used for destabilizing other nations around the world. Now let's talk debt to GDP. That's how much the US owes versus what's the US make as a country. Right now, it's over 120%. The US GDP and everything it produces is about $30 trillion. So the US owe 20% more than what it earns yearly. Economists say when the debt to GDP hits 100% or more, growth slows and risks stacks up. Japan is at 250% and hasn't collapsed yet, but its economy has been flat for decades, and most probably Japan has learned how to live in a stagnated flat economy. Now moving ahead and coming to the deficit, this is how much the US overspend annually. Fiscal year 2024's deficit was $1.8 trillion. For the first 4 months of 2025, that is October to January, the US is already at $838 billion. And this is according to Treasury Trends. Revenues may be around $4.5 trillion, but spending is $6.3 trillion. This is not an exact figure, but just an estimation. It's like earning $50,000 a year and spending $70,000. Anyone would go bust, right? But the US just keep rolling the dice. And then there's an interest, the real gut punch. In 2024, the US paid $1.1 trillion just to cover debt interest, not to shrink it, just to keep it from exploding. That's 15 to 20% of federal revenues. Projections say that interest will be $1.8 trillion in 2035. That's more than military budget today. Imagine a fifth of your paycheck vanishing to credit card fees. That's the US. However, Trump is trying to cut defense spending by half. There are many reasons behind why Trump is trying to do this. Debt is reaching to an unsustainable level, as we discussed earlier. Globalization is coming to an end and protectionism is increasing. There is no point in maintaining such a large military. At this point, many people will doubt that China might fill that gap and become a superpower. They have also rejected the offer made by Trump of reducing defense budget. Well, the simple answer is China can go ahead and spend billions and trillions and guard the trade routes and establish military bases in Europe and Africa to sustain this current structure. The possibility of that happening is close to nil. It is simply impossible for China or any country or even group of countries to spend this much money and resources and sustain this current global order. The US is leaving Europe not because it hates Europe or it doesn't want to trade with Europe. The reason is the US debt is so big now that it's unsustainable to maintain this kind of presence and structure. So now the big question is the US bankrupt? Well, unofficially, it looks like the US is bankrupt, but officially not yet. It's still able to pay its bills, but the cracks are now openly visible. Let's try to further understand this. In 2024, there were 694 major bankruptcies. That's the highest in the last 14 years. Big companies are tanking. Layoffs are happening at an industrial scale. So why is this a big deal? I mean, hiccups are normal in any economy. Well, the US is not currently in a position to afford this. A shaky economy means less tax collection, less revenue, bigger deficits, more debt. It's a feedback which is coming directly from hell. According to some estimates, the US government assets is currently at $5.7 trillion versus liabilities at negative $45.5 trillion. That's a $39.8 trillion gap. That includes long-term stuff like Social Security and Medicare promises. It's not money the US owes tomorrow, but it's a future bill. But with an aging population, the future closing in fast. So there's no escape from this hell and situation will get worse every passing year. Before we move on with our conclusion, let's first understand this rise and decline. There is no doubt that the US is a superpower and an extremely successful society. But we also can't ignore the fact that US is now on decline. Every empire is built with a strong leadership. It then rises and reaches the top, and after reaching the top, rot sets in and decline starts. Society becomes less productive, country loses its competitiveness, wealth gap increases, large debts which leads to printing more money. That sounds familiar, right? That's what is happening with the US right now. We can say that the US is currently somewhere between 12th and 15th stage of an empire. Many people and policy makers, including Donald Trump, understand this. The American empire is crumbling and the US is on brink of bankruptcy. So the question is, what's the solution for this? To be honest, there is no solution to this. All we can do is we can try to make things better. It's very natural for any big power to ultimately crumble. Okay, now let's get real. America is not yet bankrupt, but situation is heading towards that. Bankruptcy for a country means you can't pay your debts. Think default, chaos, IMF bailouts, etc., etc. America is nowhere near that. Treasury bonds are still getting snapped up globally. The dollar is still a king with 60% of the world reserves in USD. It's shrinking, but still 60% is very big. The US has paid $1.1 trillion interest last year without blinking. How did that happen? Well, monetary magic. The US prints the dollars, so it can always cover the bills. Countries like Argentina and Egypt can't. They borrow in dollars, run out, and crash. The US don't. Plus, the US economy is massive. $30 trillion drops everyone. China is at $18 trillion and they have got their own mess. Investors see the US as the safest bet, even with $36 trillion in debt. But here's the catch. This works only if trust holds. Look at history. Britain was the reserve currency king in 1800s until it wasn't. Wars, debt, and rival chipped away and pound crashed. Could that happen to the US? Maybe, but not tomorrow. But the signs are there. That 120% of GDP is a warning. Interest eating 20% of revenue is another red flag. And don't forget politics. Congress can't agree on budget, let alone fix this. Mandatory spending like Social Security, Medicare is ballooning as boomers are retiring in large number. That's $4 trillion a year locked in. Defense infrastructure is just $1.5 trillion. You would have to gut it all to balance things, and good luck with that. On top of all that, Donald Trump is trying to industrialize the US economy, but the problem is, in order to industrialize, the US will have to devalue the dollar and do massive cost cutting. And in order to do cost cutting, the US will have to increase the immigration. If you want to know more about this in details, then check my video. The link is in the description. So the conclusion is the US is not officially bankrupt, but the runway is shrinking. Unofficially, US is a bankrupt country. Now imagine this what if scenario. What would tip America into official bankruptcy or something close? There are basically three big triggers. Trigger 1, interest rate spikes. Fed rates are 4 to 5% right now. If they hit 7 to 8%, let's say inflation roars back. In this case, interest costs could double to $2 trillion a year. That's 30% of revenue. The US will have to borrow insane amounts just to pay it, spooking markets. Yields would soar, faith would crack. Trigger 2 is dollar dethroned. It means that the dollar loses its reserve currency status. There's already a hype on BRICS move. However, India and Russia have said that they are not interested in de-dollarization. And on top of that, BRICS is still small fry so far. So 20% of reserve shift away, the US would lose its borrowing edge. Debt would choke the US. Now finally, trigger 3, that is economic crash. In 2024, there were 694 bankruptcies. Now imagine 2,000 bankruptcies. Unemployment jumps to 10%, GDP shrinks by 5%, tax revenue tanks, deficits hits $3 trillion. The US would print money to survive, but inflation could spike to 10%, eroding trust. Think about 1970s stagflation, but times 10. The US is stuck with this and there's no solution unless something forced changes. What do you think that would take for that change to take place? So here's the bottom line. Is America bankrupt? Well, officially no, not today, but unofficially it's a bankrupt state. However, the US is still able to pay its debts. The dollar is strong and the world still trusts the dollar, but the trust is now quickly falling apart. $36 trillion is wild. $1.8 trillion deficits, $1.1 trillion interest, 120% debt to GDP. It all says that the US is on thin ice. It's like driving 90 mph towards a cliff. You are fine until the edge hits. But without a U-turn, less spending, more revenues, the US is flirting with disaster and ultimate collapse. Markets might give the US some more grace time, but confidence isn't infinite. So what's your call? Is the US doomed or it still has a lot of time left? Drop it in the comments. I would love to read your comments. Like it or not, this debt mess is the US future. That's all for today. Hope you loved this deep dive into America's 36 plus trillion debt drama. If you did, then smash that like button. It really helps. Subscribe if you are new. Share this with your crew and let's debate below. Bankrupt or not. See you next time. Peace out.